This video is brought to you by my Patreon subscribers. Thank you for making this show possible. And please keep in mind that this video deals with quite a few sensitive subjects. As we approach the end of the year, I think it's time to look back at the last 11 or so months and reflect on what's happened.
I don't want you to work out your wokeism on my kid. Okay?
It's not as though gender ideology has convinced everyone because it made compelling arguments. It's just scared everyone, or lots of people anyway, into silence.
Oh no. Oh my God.
We all, within Gays Against Groomers, saw this coming from a mile away. Yeah. And sadly, I don't think it's going to stop until we end this evil agenda.
Why are we butchering children if no one thinks it's a good idea? Good.
You know what? Change of plans. Since January, anti-trans rhetoric has risen exponentially in the US, and it's only getting worse. And it would be easy to just look at what's changed, but you probably already know what's happened. At the beginning of the year, people were talking about schools, and now they're talking about horrific attacks. And yeah, as a trans woman, that scares me, but I can't change that. There have always been people who don't like trans people, and they'll continue to say whatever nonsense they want no matter what I say in this video. What concerns me though, is the amount of people who want to support trans people, but don't know how. The people who confidently say trans women are women, but wouldn't be able to handle their own child being trans. The people I've met who genuinely want to help, but ultimately don't understand exactly what it is that trans people want. And I'm tired of this dance. I'm tired of seeing people tiptoe around trans rights, while those who don't want us to exist only get more direct about what they want. I think if we want to understand this wave of anti-trans rhetoric, we have to start reading between the lines. So, let's talk about the thing that people don't want to talk about. In late November, Disney released their latest animated movie, Strange World. Long story short, it hasn't done well at the box office, and there has been a lot of speculation about why.
It's called Strange World.
Oh, yeah.
It is going to lose $100 million.
Yeah,
You liked Waterworld?
Yeah.
That was one of the biggest movie flops of all time. This could absolutely eclipse those. So was Lightyear. Lightyear was a box office flop. Why? Because Disney has gone woke, and everybody's sick of that stuff. We're tired of all of that. Gay main character, this, that. I mean, everybody was either of color, they were gay, they were trans, or there was something else about them, and it just did not appeal to the American public.
Oh my God. So this guy's upset, and it seems that he thinks all trans and queer issues are part of a similar type of Disney's woke agenda or whatever. And that reflects a broader discussion happening about the movie. Many outlets are painting it as a failure because there's an openly gay protagonist. But that's just speculation. And the same thing happened a few months ago with Lightyear. Despite the fact that we're still in a pandemic and people aren't going to theaters as much as they used to, people decided to blame the film's lackluster box office performance on the fact that there was an incredibly brief lesbian kiss. And when the film did much better numbers on streaming, which is not at all unusual for Disney films released during the pandemic, of course that didn't change anything. The damage was already done, and to this day, the narrative for many people is that Disney had a lesbian kiss and the movie failed because of outrage. This narrative gained a surprising amount of traction, and it's put Disney in a really tough situation. They've had a lot of controversy over the years for putting in minuscule amounts of queer representation and marketing it as a big gesture, seemingly in an attempt to please both sides. However, in retrospect, it just seems like that has emboldened the queerphobic perspective. Forget that brief kisses have been a part of Disney movies since literally their first one. Because regardless, the people who believe that queer people just existing is a grand political gesture win when Disney makes a big deal out of something so small. But Strange World doesn't do that. Though Disney has marketed their first gay blank characters in the past, they didn't do that for this movie. And unlike in the past, this is not a one-off moment, but an openly gay protagonist. You know, the actual type of representation that queer people, including myself, have been advocating for. But having actually good representation didn't stop the headlines. After years of first gay blank, it became hard to parse and the main narrative continued, with news outlets reporting it as the first gay blank anyway and lumping it in with Disney's history of representation that is simultaneously not enough and too much depending on who you ask. It certainly doesn't help that the movie seems seems to have had an incredibly lackluster advertising budget. And since the queerphobic media outlets love talking about Disney, their articles about it have become some of the most widespread publicity for the film. I mean, I've barely seen any official press that I didn't seek out myself, yet I heard a lot about the queerphobic backlash to the movie before I even started looking into it. It's sad for me to see a beautiful film that a lot of people put a great amount of love into be buried by this queerphobic feedback loop. And I'm just speculating, but to see a mainline Walt Disney Animation Studios film have such little promotion makes me wonder if the intense anti-gay backlash from earlier this year made Disney want to avoid any more controversy. But there's something more sinister going on. The backlash to an openly gay character is because of general homophobia, but it's more complicated than that. All types of companies get backlash for including queer characters, but there's a reason why Disney is such a big deal. Disney has always been associated with family-friendly entertainment, and specifically movies for children. And for many people, Disney has represented the golden standard of that in the US for a long time. So the company's movies must not only fit what these people consider to be US American values, but also family-friendly ones. And in this situation, that does not include queerness. Viewing LGBTQ+ people and representation as a threat to children is nothing new. I've talked about how Anita Bryant's Save Our Children campaign paved the way for the modern version of this thinking, though these ideas existed well before that as well. I've even talked about when Disney has been targeted before by groups like the Southern Baptist Convention, who had an 8-year boycott against the company. Reverend Tim Benson stated that Disney's actions are just another step in the direction of making the traditional family meaningless. We're disheartened. Our main impetus behind this boycott is to encourage Disney to take a good look at who they are and what they represent to America. And like a lot of anti-queer backlash, their list of reasons for boycotting Disney were mostly about gay rights and representation, but they also put them next to unrelated behaviors. Just like the paranoid prejudices of decades past, the Southern Baptist Convention included Disney providing gay employees health insurance benefits on the same list as the company hiring a convicted to direct a movie. And putting that on a list with 4 other points exclusively about gayness shows you their prejudice. Just like Anita Bryant and just like the propaganda that came before her, from this perspective, gayness isn't something that naturally happens in humans and animals. It's a sign of corruption that can only continue existing by corrupting others. There are no human rights to corrupt our children. Earlier this year, the website Inside the Magic published an article about Disney's then recent plan to give employees and their families information on accessing gender-affirming healthcare via their company insurance benefits. This article is not only misleading, but it's also just not even accurate. The article was sourced from Christopher F. Rufo, who tweeted about a clip from a meeting. The clip featured someone from Disney talking about providing their employees with information about gender-affirming procedures and extending this to their kids, who are also covered under their employee benefits. But Rufo really ran with that phrasing and said that this type of treatment typically includes puberty blockers, breast removal, and genital surgeries for quote-unquote kids who are transitioning. Note the phrasing here. He says typically, so he doesn't actually have to know what Disney's plan is. And even though 2 out of 3 of the things he described are not typical for gender-affirming care for minors, that doesn't seem to matter, and he just fills in the blanks anyway. Let's look at what Disney's plan actually includes. In Disney's document for LGBTQIA+ resources for their employees, there are a few insurance companies that provide coverage, and as it turns out, there's actually a lot of great coverage for Disney employees. Like, as someone who lives in Germany, where facial feminization surgery is mostly not covered by public health insurance, I think it's really cool that Disney's health insurance plans do. But nowhere in this document or on the health insurance providers' websites does it say anything about surgeries being performed on kids who are transitioning. Just puberty blockers and potential hormone replacement therapy after counseling. That doesn't mean that gender-affirming surgeries don't happen to minors, but only in certain situations alongside medical guidelines and consistent previous treatment. But we'll come back to that later, because it's far from what Rufo is making it out to be. Surgeries are just not part of typical gender-affirming care for minors. But these facts don't seem to matter. The guy saw they referred to kits of employees and filled in what he wanted to see. So the story isn't that Disney is providing gender-affirming healthcare to employees and their families based on thorough scientific protocol and the viewpoints of organizations like the American Medical Association and the American Academy of Pediatrics. Instead, it's that Disney is helping kids get sex changes. So then some journalist for Inside the Magic cites this paranoid analysis, and their own headline follows it. Disney helps employees and children transition with gender-affirming surgeries. And of course, just like in the Rufo tweet, gender-affirming is in scare quotes, as if it is some new experimental thing, as opposed to an umbrella term for medical treatments that have been developed, researched, and used over the last 100 years. And as I'm sure you may imagine, a lot of the comments are not so great. Encouraging the conception of minors at their request is evil and from the pit of hell. Walt Disney is spinning in his grave. Beginning of the end. Procreation will become extinct. And this disgusting practice is yet another reason why my family canceled our Disney vacation in May. There are two genders, people. Follow the science. What you are doing and promoting is an abomination. So sick. Those who promote this evil will one day pay dearly. God is not okay with this, and he has warned of the punishment for hurting children. We will never go to Disney or support any business with this Satanistic company. Oh my God. I'm sorry, I know this is a serious conversation and I do want to take it seriously, but I have no problem talking about science and the efficacy of trans healthcare, but when you invoke Satan, what am I supposed to do with that? And frankly, I don't think religion is inherently in opposition to trans rights. I know many people use it that way, but even though I'm not religious, I do know many trans people who are for a variety of reasons. Yes, I just have no interest in refuting comments like this. I'd rather talk about what we're actually here to discuss, which is healthcare. So anyway, the comments in this article are a bit wild, but let's put a pin in that because it's also a bit more complicated. To fully understand though, we have to go back further because this controversy happened in April and was just another notch in the belt of a growing anti-Disney, anti-trans wave. At the beginning of the year, people were talking about schools. This was mainly because of a then recent bill that had come out of Florida, House Bill 1557, officially called the Parental Rights in Education Bill. It quickly became controversial. Those who supported it called it the anti-bill, while those against it called it Don't Say Gay. And though the bill was passed and is already in effect, the conversation around it hasn't stopped. And it's also controversial in the Disney community, since the company is such a huge cultural force, especially in Florida. Early on, many queer employees of Disney were upset that the company wasn't saying anything, and since the bill was introduced, it's become a hot topic in the Disney fandom. Acknowledging gay people existing is not teaching sex. If it were actually Don't Say Gay Bill, I'd be right there with you. But it isn't. Disney should stay out of politics when they are fighting a bill that gives parents the right to choose when their children are taught about sexuality in schools. Disney wasn't dragged into the battle, they poked their nose into it, and now dislike the consequences. Disney will continue to fight for teaching kindergartners about sex. Wait, let's stop there, because that guy is an editor and author at That Park Place, a website that's written a lot about the bill. And after Disney eventually released a statement in opposition to the bill, they had a lot to say. Given that this legislation purports to stop official curriculum of kindergarten classrooms from featuring gender fluidity and/or sexual orientation lessons, it is now an accepted fact that the Walt Disney Company takes an affirmative position as to the right of the state to educate very small children about explicit sexual concepts in opposition to the child's parents. I feel like we should look at what the bill actually says to see where they're coming from. Oh, and I say they because this article was technically written by the That Park Place newsroom, so I guess it technically could be from anybody. Anyway, the main part of the bill people are worried about says classroom instruction by school personnel or third parties on sexual orientation or gender identity may not occur in kindergarten through grade 3 or in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards. And usually when talking about the bill, people just reference that. So what does it mean? That Park Place referenced teaching explicit sexual concepts to children, but it doesn't say that in the bill. It just says sexual orientation. Oh, but there's also a later article from the site that goes into more detail. The law forbids classroom instruction about sexual orientation of any kind or gender identity of any kind in classes for kids who are mostly 5 to 8 years old. In other words, you cannot instruct a child about heterosexuality or homosexuality. You cannot tell a child that being straight is right or that being gay is right. Okay, that's more in line with what the bill actually says, but I think it's a bit misleading. They say classes for kids mostly 5 to 8 years old, referencing the kindergarten to 3rd grade thing, but the bill is not just about that. in kindergarten through grade 3, or in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards. Who decides the state standards? The law has already gone into effect, and there are no available state standards to reference, and no definitions as to what constitutes sexual orientation or gender identity, let alone appropriate discussions of them. And because of the "or" carrying a lot of weight in that sentence, anybody can open up these requirements to grades 4 through 12. But sure, that Park Place said mostly, so I guess you could say they didn't mean exclusively. But their phrasing shows what I think is one of the deceptive things about the bill. The first half of the sentence puts the focus on kindergarten through 3rd grade, so the discussion is usually about that instead of the vague wording of the second half. What are the state standards that decide if something is appropriate? Also, people zero in on the word instruction, but in the intro to the bill, it's specified that one of the purposes of it is to prohibit classroom discussion about sexual orientation or gender identity. The word discussion was in an earlier draft at the same section they referenced earlier, but it was removed. However, it's still in the intro to the final bill and on the official Senate website. I guess you could argue that discussion is similar to instruction, but then why was it removed from the actual bill in the first place? It just seems vague when even the Florida Senate doesn't appear to know exactly what the bill prohibits. I also find it interesting that in the article from that Park Place, they focus on heterosexuality and homosexuality being equal in this situation. I agree. I mean, if there's a law about sexuality, it should include all types of it. But does this bill include both of those? Because in theory, you could say yes, but like many laws, there is what's written and then there's how it's used. There are plenty of children's books in which a character has parents. Is it considered teaching sexuality if the character has 2 moms or 2 dads? You may say no. But if a child doesn't understand, they might ask a question about that. And if the teacher responds, they can be held in violation of state law. I think the person who wrote this article might reply that the bill isn't targeting things like that. But thankfully, it's been a few months since the bill went into effect, and we can see how it's worked so far. Keep in mind that since it doesn't seem like there are any hard guidelines or definitions to go off of, each district has handled it differently and has been interpreting the bill as best they can. One district specifically clarified that gay teachers can have photos of their spouses on their desks, though teachers in kindergarten through 3rd grade were cautioned against mentioning that they're gay. And another school district got rid of children's books that showed LGBTQ topics. And yes, one of those books was a book where the character had gay parents. And elsewhere, there are parents currently trying to get books with queer themes and characters removed from public school libraries, citing House Bill 1557, and also another bill that bans pornography in schools. And no, the books targeted aren't only for kindergarten through 3rd grade. Some of the books targeted have also been for high schoolers, which is funny to me because the Florida Department of Education still has 1984 on the recommended curriculum for 9th grade, which has depictions of straight sex, but that's not on their list of books they want to remove. Truthfully, just like the state of Florida, I do not care if a 9th grader reads 1984, but I'm bringing this up because when we can drop the illusion that being queer or trans is being treated on the same level as straight or cis, we can talk about what's actually happening. House Bill 1557 also goes beyond just classroom instruction. In another part of the bill, it says that parents should be notified regarding any change in a student's mental, emotional, or physical health or well-being, or a change in related services or monitoring. One school district got a letter from the Department of Education saying that they believed a few of the policies found in the district's LGBTQ+ resources guide violated the bill, and a bunch of other districts got similar letters. In this situation, one of the things that they believed violated the bill was that students were able to be referred to by the name and pronouns that they chose, and there was no clarification on how to inform parents about this. The issue with this is that they believed it could fall into the section I mentioned earlier about health and well-being, which would mean that if a student were to change name and pronouns at school, this would have to be communicated to their parents. And that's interesting to me, because one of the big controversies about the bill early on was that the same section about well-being would result in outing students who were not straight or cis, especially after an amendment gained controversy after saying parents should be told about any changes within 6 weeks. The amendment was quickly withdrawn, and any allegations that this part of the bill could be used to out students were denied by some of its supporters. However, this letter from the Board of Education seems to suggest that if a student changes their name or pronouns, something common for trans and non-binary people to do regardless of what's taught in class, their parents will be notified. So much for not outing students. Of course, I'm sure someone could still retort about how the bill does not exclude queer people on paper, but anyone remotely familiar with the history of queer rights can tell you that situations like this are not unique. US anti-sodomy laws on paper could be used against anyone, but primarily in the second half of the 20th century, they were mainly used to target gay people. People had limited visitation rights for their own children, they were fired from jobs, and anti-gay hate crimes weren't prosecuted, all in the name of anti-sodomy laws. So, queer people already know the difference between what's written and how it's used. But ultimately, I don't think this bill is about learning. As the bill's title suggests, it seems more about giving parents control over what their kids are exposed to. But why don't queer parents also have that right? When depictions of heterosexuality are part of the curriculum, what does that say about the state's standards? It's no surprise to me that the Don't Say Gay bill has been so confusing for many people. It's incredibly vague, and how it's used depends on the morals of the society enforcing it. And as I'm sure you probably know, the queerphobia I spoke about earlier hasn't gone away. The paranoia about queerness being some type of contagion that corrupts people is still going strong. And so it doesn't surprise me how this bill has been used so far. And the focus on little children, when we've seen how all-encompassing the bill actually is, just reminds me of Anita Bryant and how her rhetoric focused on children while trying to limit gay rights in general. Though it's been a few decades since being gay was removed from the International Classification of Diseases, transness wasn't removed until a few years ago. And there are still many prejudices floating around about what it means to be trans, which brings us back to the comments on that Inside the Magic article. One of the cruelest prejudices about trans people is that they are mentally broken. There are many reasons for this assumption, but the most popular one on the internet seems to come from an analysis of the 2014 National Transgender Discrimination Survey that found that 41% of trans people surveyed said that they had attempted suicide. There are a few reasons as to why the statistic and the analysis should be scrutinized, but just know that that's where it comes from. This has not only resulted in the meme of people spamming trans people, including me, with comments about the 41%, but combined with other prejudices, it's resulted in a belief that trans people are unstable. According to this view, trans people don't deal with mental illness and trauma because they live in an incredibly unaccepting world and are treated poorly, often because they are different. Instead, people say that trans people are this way because to be trans is to be broken or corrupted. This allegation that trans people are unstable because being trans is inherently unstable is cyclical and does nothing to actually solve the issue, which is that many trans people do not live in an environment that accepts them. But it's a quite effective argument for anti-trans rhetoric, because if you can convince yourself that the other person is insane, you don't have to take anything they say seriously. And there's a very thin line between mental illness, perversion, and, as Anita Bryant said, corrupting children. Being vague is the point.
There was a story, this woman put out this thing, and it kind of sums it all up. She is saying that trans people aren't out to abuse kids because most of them were abused themselves. That's what they said. And since most of them were abused themselves, now they're trans, and well, it's kind of what we're trying to stop there. Exactly what we're trying to stop. This whole trans thing has gotten way out of control. I don't know if it was ever in control, but it has gotten way beyond the pale of even good common decency.
There it is. The same shit that was used decades ago for gay people. And it's totally in line with people who view transness as some sort of disorder, some sort of illness. These innocent kids have no clue about gender and being anything but a kid. Any adult who tries to force them into something they aren't ready for is abusive. Studies have shown that conversion therapy and other similar methods do not work. You cannot steer someone away from being trans if that's who they are. And despite what this comment says, kids very much know about gender. I mean, they're placed into a gender as soon as they're born. And in terms of transness, in the medical field, there isn't really a debate about how to help trans kids. We know what treatment is statistically effective. And in fact, many major medical organizations are in support of trans healthcare for minors. Just like being gay, we don't know exactly what makes someone trans. There have been attempts to understand it, but ultimately the science has shifted in the last few decades to focus on treatment instead. So what we do know is that when you treat people who are trans or non-binary with respect and affirming care, they live happier, healthier, and longer lives. And we have the data for this. The largest study of its kind recently showed that 98% of participants who began puberty blockers and then hormone replacement therapy as teenagers were still continuing treatment between 4 and 6 years later. But people are scared to talk about giving trans kids healthcare. So let's go back to Disney. We already know that the headline that they're providing sex changes to children is sensationalized nonsense. Like I mentioned earlier, there are certain situations where minors can get gender-affirming surgeries with parental consent, but those situations are only done alongside established medical guidelines and previous consistent treatment. And when I say certain situations, I mean very specific ones. First off, trans surgeries in the US are not covered by many health insurance companies until one is 18. And in the situations where they're deemed medically necessary for minors, they are usually done after years of treatment and a consistent gender identity. Even then, they're mostly only given to 16 and 17-year-olds. People have written articles about how 13-year-olds are being given mastectomies, but by looking through the sources of those articles, I've only been able to find 3 people, 2 from a study and 1 from someone posting on Reddit. And if you want to obsess about the exception anyway, keep in mind that all 3 of those situations were satisfied with the results, and the study that the 2 minors came from had a 98.5% satisfaction rate. When people were threatening the Boston Children's Hospital earlier this year for allegedly giving minors hysterectomies, that was proven to never even be happening in the first place. The reality is that just like many surgeries that happen to minors, like knee surgeries and breast reduction surgeries to avoid back pain, gender-affirming surgeries are always done according to established guidelines with parental consent, and usually after years of consistent treatment. And regardless of what some people might claim, the fact is that they are far from the typical gender-affirming care for minors. So what is typical gender-affirming care for minors? That can mean anything from playing with makeup, using a different name or different pronouns, getting a new haircut, or trying different clothes. These things are obviously not inherently tied to healthcare, but having a therapist is, and talking to someone who has experience with transness can be helpful for younger people just beginning to understand their feelings into gender. And if a minor indicates that they are interested in taking puberty blockers, there is a medical process that can be triggered to get them that care. Since puberty can start at a variety of ages, there's not a specific time in which these are given, but they're not being given out like candy, like many anti-trans narratives would want you to believe. Puberty blockers are usually taken for up to 2 years to relieve the discomfort that many trans minors feel when going through the wrong puberty, and the effects are completely reversible. And to anyone concerned about this supposedly being a new practice, puberty blockers have actually been used since the 80s for cis minors, so we already have the long-term data to know that they are safe. After puberty blockers, one can decide to start hormone replacement therapy or just resume the previous puberty they had already begun. Since hormone replacement therapy is basically inducing puberty, this can lead to physical changes. If those changes make one feel uncomfortable, they can simply stop the treatment. It's puberty, so it doesn't happen overnight. And if one gets far enough that there are irreversible changes, like a deeper voice due to vocal tract changes in those going through a testosterone-based puberty, there are still some things that can be done, like it's possible to retrain the voice through therapy to achieve a more feminine sound. But despite all this, even people very sympathetic to trans rights can be confused by the whole trans healthcare for minors thing. I have spoken with people who genuinely do support me, but don't know what they would do if their child came out. And truthfully, that's because the anti-trans rhetoric actually brings up some good questions. Like, what if someone regrets their transition? What if they feel pressured into it? I'm no medical expert, but when talking about healthcare, I don't think these are wrong questions to ask. However, most of the worry is fear-mongering, and this obsession with regret is just not equally applied to situations outside of transness. From the data we have, we know that a small percentage of people who receive gender-affirming care end up detransitioning, and we also know that a majority of people who detransition do so not because they wanted to, but because they felt too much pressure from others. So, a decent number of people who detransition end up retransitioning later down the line. However, if you want to focus on regret, we can, but why is there only this intense scrutiny about trans healthcare? In the US, a study showed that 18% of participants expressed discontent a year after their knee surgery. That's a huge difference to the 2% that stopped hormone treatment in the previous study about trans issues. And even if you take into account that the knee surgery study had less participants than the trans one, that's still a huge discrepancy. But you don't see people talking about how we need to ban knee surgeries because of the various risks and complications. And to paraphrase the wonderful Arden Hart from the Transatlantic Call-In show, why would you deny 98% of people health care because it didn't work for 2%? I've had rheumatoid arthritis since I was 8 years old. From a young age, I was put on medications that had and still have severe risks for my body. These effects were made clear to me, and my mother and I accepted them, knowing that the pain I was going through with my joints was something that needed to be treated. You may argue that I couldn't have truly understood the consequences, for example, of putting stress on my liver with the medications I was given throughout high school, but that's not how medicine usually works. There are risks and complications with a variety of things. This is why medicine is often focused on harm reduction, on providing the best possible outcome in a world where there are often checks and balances to consider, and everybody's body reacts differently. This isn't about policies and positions. This is about good versus evil. When Disney offers healthcare to employees that can help their children transition, I have to wonder what evil is being committed here. We've already seen that the reporting about the whole situation is just not accurate. And we've also seen that trans people suffer significant distress from not being able to transition and living in a world that refuses to acknowledge their existence. Are the people worried about regret rates with trans kids as concerned about treatment for juvenile rheumatoid arthritis? I think you know the answer. When I look at the comments on the Inside the Magic article, I just feel sad. I only featured it in this video because I think it's a good example of everything I'm talking about. The inaccurate reporting, hysteria about transness, and overall just a lack of empathy for what trans people are going through. But I can find those comments on many sites, both in and out of the Disney fandom. And though I don't live in the US anymore, transphobia has intensified around the world. You have people talking about how horrific it is for people who detransition to have gone through the wrong puberty, usually with women who took testosterone, detransitioned, and now deal with the lingering effects of that. But interestingly enough, there's no empathy there for trans people going through the same exact thing. No discussion about people like me being forced to go through a puberty that wasn't right, and as a result has made my life significantly more difficult. There's also a part to anti-trans rhetoric that thinks being trans is homophobic. I've read countless stories from gay people who think that quote-unquote gender ideology is a way to remove feminine men or masculine women from society. And I think it's a bit odd of a criticism, especially when every single trans friend I have is not straight. But sure, if you want to find them, there are stories of detransitioners who have felt that way. But where is the empathy for the exact opposite? Where is the empathy for those who grew up and thought that they were just feminine boys? The people who tried so desperately to be gay, but failed? Because that's what happened to me. Had I known earlier and had the resources to be myself, I could have saved myself from so much confusion. But instead, I was just trying to be gay. And that would have been fine if it were who I am. But I'm not a gay man. I'm just a straight trans woman. I was always more attracted to straight men for some reason, but just assumed it was wanting what I couldn't have. It wasn't until I got to college and ended up getting with quite a few recently divorced men that I noticed a pattern. It seems like I was craving this dynamic specifically between men and women, but couldn't name it. It's a really abstract experience that's difficult to describe. I had plenty of trans and gay friends at the time, but had never heard of a similar experience happening before. So I found comfort in identifying as non-binary and assumed that part of me was expressing a feminine side of that. But this was not a fun period of exploration. This was a deeply sad part of my life, where I felt like I was just flinging myself at everything, just to feel as alone and desperate as ever. My body wasn't mine. I just tailored it to what the men I wanted to be with were looking for. It would take many, many years to realize that I was a woman and begin transitioning, and I'm glad I did. But had I known earlier that I could have done it, I definitely would have started as soon as possible. And I really f***ing resent that some people think that there's a divide between gay and trans, as if people in both of those communities don't know the purpose of treating others with love and having empathy for experiences outside of what you know. Language is an incredibly powerful tool. It's always changing and evolving in a world where we are all figuring out what it means to be human. It's a helpful way to understand that others have been here before. Opening up a dictionary can feel like looking at a cultural fingerprint, seeing the things people have felt and seen and defined for generations to come. When I was younger, I had sharp pain in my head sometimes, but I just let it pass because I hadn't heard anyone talk about it. But once I heard the word headache, I could tell an adult about it and they were able to help me treat it. And the same thing happened for attraction. Growing up, I was told boys could only like girls, and I didn't, so I felt pressured to play along. When I hit puberty and realized I was attracted to men, it took a long time to even realize that it was attraction because I wasn't told that was a possibility. And it was the same thing for transness. I was still struggling to find the vocab that had been withheld from me. No one should have to spend their life doing that. Nobody should have to waste their time flailing around, trying to find a way to describe feelings others have felt before. Not everyone will feel things the same way. Words are not everything, but they're a good start. So say gay and say trans. This video hasn't been about Disney music, like my work usually is. But since I often look at queerness as it relates to Disney, and this subject has also been a huge controversy this year, transitioning has been amazing and life-saving, but it's also been incredibly frustrating to transition during what has been such a horrible year for trans and non-binary people. The trans panic has only gotten more intense, and it doesn't look like it's stopping anytime soon. I started this channel back in 2019 when there hadn't really been much positive and open queer representation from Disney yet. There was some, but most of it was incredibly subtle and seemed like carefully curated moments that could easily be ignored or edited out. So having an openly gay protagonist in a theatrically released movie was still a long way off, but growing up, that never stopped me from empathizing. And the music of Disney had always been an escape. And since I noticed that that never really changed as I grew up, I started making videos about the things that I felt. And as it turns out, there were tons of queer people who felt the same way. Tons of queer people who also didn't grow up with the words to describe their experiences. So they saw themselves in Ariel, in Mulan, in Belle, Tiana, Elsa, and Moana. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. One of the most beautiful and admirable things about queer experience is the ability to persevere no matter what the conditions. And so I'm glad to have a movie like Strange World, an official Walt Disney Animation Studios film with an openly gay protagonist. And I'm happy that Disney employees and their children can live in a world where they get gender-affirming treatment. Nobody has all the answers, but the least we can do is try to help each other find out how far we'll go. Every turn I take, every trail I try,